So, mining in the Spanish Empire, you saw a hunt for gold and silver because conquistadors needed these raw precious metals in order to trade with China and trade with other empires as well. And in fact, the Inca and Aztec treasures that were taken, these are precious, instances in history where it essentially melted down into ingots to be brought back to Spain. It was awful. So a lot of the gold treasures from the New World are gone forever. Gold not expensive in Spanish holdings, but silver relatively plentiful, and they would often trade silver for gold, but they would also give the silver to the Chinese. They used extensive employment of natives. They incorporated the Inca Mita system of conscripted labor. So at certain times of the year in the Inca Empire, they would force people to work in industrial production or production of infrastructure, like roads. They were oftentimes in dangerous working conditions for the miners, and they would eventually be assimilated to Spanish culture. Here's an example of a silver mine. Pretty awful. So the global significance of silver, we talked about it before. Essentially, Chinese loved silver and used it as their currency, and they wanted it, so they would use it to trade for Chinese luxury goods. Here's just an example of a Manila galleon route and the lands of Oceania, kind of the trade from New Spain to Manila. Manila would be kind of the trading outpost for this trade between New Spain and China for the Spanish crown. The Hacienda was also a common thing in the New World. So they were these large estates that would essentially use the encomienda system of forced native labor. And on these estates, they would produce wheat, grapes, and meat. They would essentially provide all these things for the local mines and local towns. They mainly grew things that were European in origin. It would eventually be replaced because with another system, debt patronage or debt slavery, because the native people, had enough with the mistreatment that they experienced under the encomienda system and eventually their repartimiento system. So they wanted fair wages, and they never really got them. They were oftentimes overworked. So when debt patronage became popular, you would see kind of the dissolution of the encomienda system because they were just treated their workers awful. Here's a hacienda in Chile example. There was also like I said, there was resistance to the Spanish rule. The Pueblo Revolt in 1680, a massive revolt. 1780, the Tupac Amaru Rebellion in Peru, who claimed to be a descendant from the king of Peru. He led that. A lot of the natives did not agree to work very hard for their Spanish overlords and refused to work. In fact, there was an appeal to the Spanish crown that was sent by Guaman Poma, who basically said, hey, we are being mistreated here in Peru. He wrote a 1,200-page letter to the King of Spain. Never made its way there. And it was eventually found in a library in 1908 in Denmark, oddly enough. Probably deliberately got lost. I'm surprised it wasn't destroyed. But anyways, the Portuguese had a similar system. They didn't really have the encomienda system because they used slave labor more than the local native population. But they did have things like haciendas. They had sugar mills. They were called engenhos. I think I'm pronouncing that correctly. I don't know any Portuguese. But it refers to a complex of land, labor. So basically anything that goes with the production of sugar, it's there on the engenho. And sugar cane was taken from molasses and then was refined to sugar for export, either sugar or molasses. Didn't make much off of it. Low profit margins, so you have to produce a lot, and thus the Portuguese relied on conscripted or forced labor, and mainly in African slaves. They didn't really use the native populations because the natives pretty much escaped into the forests of the Amazon and refused to work for the Portuguese, whereas that was a lot more difficult in New Spain and New Castile. Large-scale importation of slaves would begin in 1580. So once the Portuguese had established, slave trading outposts in their trading empire, going back to some things we just learned, they began to import slaves from Africa, West Africa. Working conditions were absolutely awful in these sugar plantations. 5%, 10% of their labor would die on these sugar plantations. So thus they had to find new labor, and they were constantly importing slaves. So they put a value on the life of them. 1 ton of sugar was worth the life of 1 slave. So they would just go get more. They wouldn't expect them to have children, the slaves. They would just go get more from Africa because they had very little value on the life of African slaves. Just absolutely awful. Here's an example of the Genoa. Sorry for the quality, but you can look them up. Pretty much everything to the production of sugar was done here in the Portuguese colony of Brazil. So indigenous peoples also kind of worked with people in North America, but they weren't really conscripted as laborers so much as they traded with the local people. They traded pelts for wool blankets, iron, firearms. Alcohol would be the big thing. Alcohol. There's a lot of alcohol problems with natives here in North America today because of this, because they were willing to trade a lot of what they had that was of value for alcohol, and it ruined a lot of native people's livelihoods. And the Europeans knew this. They absolutely knew this. And it's awful. Beaver hunts. The hunt for beaver pelts by fur trappers would often occur on native territories and lead to conflicts. In fact, the French and Indian War, a lot of it was fought over controlling fur trade. Natives would attack each other and kill and maim each other for control of fur trade lands. It was absolutely awful, just the amount of conflict that happened because of controlling land in the Americas. So the Europeans, cultivators, would displace natives, but they'd also require their assistance, like we said earlier, in colonies like Roanoke. They needed their help to know how to grow things in these areas. What do I grow now? Well, you need to be growing corn, not wheat, in this area. And so they gradually learned, Europeans, from native populations. But then they began to notice, especially in the further south, in Virginia and further south, that they could produce products for European markets, cash crops. And these cash crops were tobacco, rice, indigo, and cotton. And tobacco was especially important because it was addictive, and they could make a lot of money off the growth of tobacco. In fact, a lot of the world's tobacco comes from Virginia and the Mid-Atlantic, as it's called in geography. Incredibly important to the tobacco industry today. So that called for an increase in the importation of slave labor. Some of it was through indentured servants, people who were from Europe that said, I want to go to the Americas, but if you want to come, all right, that's fine. We'll pay for your voyage, but you have to work off your how much it cost for the voyage. Usually on 4 to 7 years terms. They were usually people who were unemployed, orphans, political prisoners, criminals. So a lot of America's early population were criminals and political prisoners, people of not high status in Europe. So here we see kind of the export of tobacco from Virginia, just how much it grew. This addictive weed, so to speak, became very, very popular with the Europeans. So with this, while the majority of slaves did not come to North America, it did increase the need for them into the Americas by 1610. So it was less prominent in the north due to you can't grow many cash crops there. But slave trading was important to the American economy. They were forced to work and put sugar plantations, cotton plantations, and tobacco plantations. And as you see on this map, we're looking at North America. Only about 500,000 slaves went there. Not many were really brought to that area of the world. As you can see, the majority are brought to the Caribbean and the South America and Brazil especially. The majority of your slaves went to those areas of the world. Large numbers. So, additionally, besides another motivator for activity in this area was Christianity and bringing Christian doctrine to the people of these regions. So the Spaniards, when they colonized Mexico and Latin America, taught Christian doctrine and literacy from Franciscan orders, Dominican orders, Jesuit orders, And they were mainly responsible for not only teaching Christianity and spreading Christianity, but also accumulating cultural knowledge on the people they're missionaries for and to. As you can see, Bernardino de Sahagún was responsible for essentially taking down the history, culture, literature of the people in Mexico. So vastly important to basically preserving the cultures and traditions that had been destroyed by the Spanish now through Christian missions. But many of the natives were convinced that these plagues and diseases that had happened to them were a result of their gods abandoning them, and thus converted to Catholicism in large numbers. Catholicism is still a very large part of Latin American society and the New World. If you even in Texas, Roman Catholicism has a very large population. And the Virgin of Guadalupe became essentially a national icon of Mexico. And it was claimed to have been seen in a vision by a native man, I think near Mexico City, a peasant there. And now she's essentially an icon to the people of Mexico. So, the French and English were also missions further north and trying to convert the native populations. They weren't as effective as those in New Spain and New Castile, but they did have large numbers of missions up north as well. So Australia was also a part of this world. The Europeans were convinced, but even in the 2nd century, that they had known of an unknown southern land, Terra Australis Incognita, in the south, and they finally found it. Portuguese mariners in the region, but Dutch sailors make first recorded sighting in 1606. So first recorded sighting was in 1606. And unfortunately for the people who surveyed it from the Dutch East India Trading Company, determined that this place has little value to us. The only industries here are fishing and foraging industries, and we're just not interested in that. It wouldn't be until about late 18th century with James Cook kind of landing at Botany Bay that you'd start to see the establishment of Australia as a penal colony for convicts in England. Ship them off. We don't want them anymore. We'll let them stay there with the Aboriginal people of Australia. Here's an image of an Aboriginal. Again, they're a foraging society, fishing society, essentially a hunter-gatherer society, equipped with a boomerang. So, the Pacific Islands were extremely important to the Spaniards because they offered a kind of a stop between Mexico and the Philippines. The islands of Guam and the Marianas were significant because they laid on trade routes, so they'd stop there to resupply. So they colonized these places for that very reason. Guam is actually in the United States because of a conflict between us and Spain. So now it's part of the United States protectorates. From the 1670s to 1680s, they took control of the islands. Smallpox destroyed local populations. Most of the population there is of European origin now. James Cook visited Hawaii in 1778. He had a good relationship with the Hawaiians, but sexually transmitted diseases were brought to Hawaii as a result. And in 1779, he was actually killed in a petty dispute between him and locals. So it didn't work out too well for him. But the big thing from this unit that we just looked at with the New Worlds, the Americas, and Oceania, is we start to see the formation of a completely new society, a blended society, especially in Latin America, where you have a new racial hierarchy coming up, new labor systems emerging, the movement of people, and for better or for worse, and also the movement of just the discovery of the Western world by Europeans leads to a completely new world that all of us are living in today. So hope you enjoyed, and I'll talk to you later.